January 1945. A cold wind drifts across the barbed wire of a U.S. Army POW camp in the Mariana Islands. The war is still raging hundreds of miles away, but here, the night is strangely calm, floodlights hum, boots crunch on gravel, and a single Japanese soldier, thin, dirt-stained, barely able to stand, is escorted into the camp infirmary. He has not slept on anything soft in months. He has eaten little more than handfuls of rice and rainwater. He carries the quiet, trembling expectation that every step toward the Americans brings him closer to torture or death. Inside, the air smells of disinfectant and laundered cotton. An American medic pulls back a curtain, revealing a neatly made bed. White sheets, clean wool blanket. A pillow fluffed into a gentle rise. The soldier freezes. His breathing halts. He waits for the deception, the blow, the cruelty he was promised. But nothing comes. A medic simply gestures for him to lie down. The soldier's shoulders collapse. His vision blurs. A single tear escapes, falling not from relief, but from the sudden collapse of a lifetime of fear. And to understand how that moment became possible, we must look back at the world that shaped him. Long before that tear fell onto an American pillow, the world that shaped that young Japanese soldier had been tightening around him for more than a decade. The Japan of his childhood was not yet the empire of steel and fire it would become. But by the 1930s, the nation had turned sharply toward militarism, nationalism, and a rigid code of obedience that would define an entire generation. Schools taught loyalty to the emperor as the highest virtue. Newspapers praised sacrifice. Radio broadcasts warned that Japan was encircled by hostile Western powers, each secretly planning to destroy the nation and enslave its people. This fear shaped everything that followed. By 1937, with the invasion of China underway, Japanese society marched toward total war, industrial, cultural, and psychological. For young men entering military service, the transition was brutal. Training camps replaced individuality with uniformity. Recruits were struck for hesitating, berated for weakness, conditioned to obey instantly and without question. The Imperial Japanese Army believed suffering forged courage. Hardship was not a burden, it was a weapon. And within this culture, one principle was hammered constantly into the minds of soldiers. Death is honorable, capture is not. Under the Bushido-inspired doctrines of the era, surrender was worse than failure. It was a stain carried not only by the soldier, but by his family. Manuals told troops to fight until the last bullet, then charge with the bayonet. If that failed, detonation of a grenade against one's chest was encouraged. A soldier who fell into enemy hands had embraced disgrace, and the enemy was portrayed as merciless. American troops, in particular, were demonized as barbarians who tortured prisoners and mutilated bodies. This fear mattered. It shaped decisions in every jungle clearing, on every volcanic ridge, on every island where men faced starvation and encirclement. Most Japanese soldiers simply could not imagine surrender. They had never been allowed to imagine it. As the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, the Japanese military moved from victory to victory. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines. Each triumph reinforced the belief that discipline and spiritual strength outweighed technology. Soldiers saw their commanders as near mythic figures. They believed the empire's rise was unstoppable, but the tide shifted. Midway in June 1942 shattered Japanese naval power. Guadalcanal drained manpower and morale. By 1944, American logistics, vast, relentless, unimaginable to the average Japanese infantryman, began to crush every island garrison. Cut off from supply, entire units withered. Men survived on coconuts, insects, and muddy water. Malaria and dysentery killed more than bullets. And still, surrender felt impossible. It was common for Japanese troops to hide in caves, waiting for a final assault. Many chose suicide rather than capture. Others charged American lines with empty rifles, knowing the outcome but unwilling to face the shame. The rare few who allowed themselves to be taken prisoner did so only when exhaustion broke their ability to resist. This was the state of mind American forces encountered. Starving men shaped by a lifetime of propaganda, expecting cruelty as soon as they raised their hands. Yet the United States, bound by the Geneva Convention and guided by its own military doctrine, took a different approach. POW camps in the Pacific Theater varied in quality, but many, especially those operated by the U.S. Army and Navy, offered medical care, regular meals, and humane treatment. Some camps even provided work programs, language instruction, and opportunities for repatriation after the war. For American guards and medics, this was simply procedure. For Japanese captives, it felt impossible. At the same time, U.S. intelligence officers understood something crucial. A healthy, well-treated POW was more likely to speak about supply routes, unit morale, island fortifications, or the inner mechanisms of the Imperial Army. Kindness, in this context, held strategic value, but for the young soldier who would one day stand trembling before an American bed, this reality did not yet exist. He still lived inside that world of fear, hunger, and indoctrination, unaware that everything he believed about the enemy was about to collapse. And as the war closed in around him, his journey toward that moment of unexpected humanity began in the desperation of a collapsing empire. The pressures mounting on his unit would soon drive him toward capture and toward a world utterly unlike the one he had been taught to fear. By late 1944, the psychological and physical landscape facing Japanese soldiers had shifted beyond recognition. Entire divisions that once marched with rigid precision were now fragmented bands of survivors scattered across shrinking island fronts. Supplies that were promised by headquarters never arrived. Letters from home, if they came at all, spoke of shortages, ration lines, and air raids that hinted at a war slipping out of Japan's control. In these conditions, the soldier's world narrowed to the simplest instincts: find water, avoid patrols, brace for bombardment. Hunger hollowed out men who had once believed themselves unbreakable. Their uniforms rotted under the ceaseless humidity. Their boots fell apart. Many walked barefoot over coral, each step a reminder of a future that was evaporating before them. Still, the indoctrination held. Even when surrounded, even when disease gnawed at their strength, many Japanese troops clung to their belief that Americans would inflict unspeakable suffering if they surrendered. Propaganda leaflets issued by the Imperial General Staff warned that U.S. forces burned prisoners alive or executed them for sport. Rumors spread through jungle camps, each story more vivid than the last. By the time American forces closed in on island garrisons, many Japanese soldiers had fully internalized a single conclusion: better to die quickly by your own hand than slowly in the hands of the enemy. Yet the truth was different. American field commanders, aware of the intensity of Japanese indoctrination, often instructed their men to show restraint and offer opportunities for surrender. Loudspeakers broadcast assurances in Japanese. Leaflets explained that POWs would receive food and medical care, but years of conditioning could not be erased by a message dropped from the sky. Most troops ignored them. Some burned them. Others memorized the instructions but could not bring themselves to act on them. As conditions worsened, however, a small but growing number of Japanese soldiers did surrender. Some were too weak to continue fighting. Others were cut off from their units, and a few simply no longer believed they were dying for a cause that still existed. When these men emerged from the jungle or crawled from caves, they encountered a world they had never imagined. American camps were not paradises. Some were overcrowded or hastily constructed, but compared to the collapsing conditions of the front, they felt unreal. Prisoners were screened, searched, and questioned, then transported to holding areas where meals were regulated, water was safe to drink, and medical supplies were actually available, not the illusions their own army had been unable to provide for months. For many, the first shock came during medical inspection. American doctors, accustomed to treating their own wounded, worked quickly through lines of prisoners, checking fevers, binding wounds, and distributing quinine or sulfa powder. Some Japanese POWs recoiled from the touch of a medic, convinced it was the prelude to some cruel experiment. Others stared blankly, unable to reconcile the care they received with what they had been told. The cultural gulf deepened this confusion. In Japan, the military ideal glorified self-denial and asceticism. Sleeping on hard floors was common. Blankets were thin. Comfort was considered weakness. In the U.S. Army, by contrast, logistical abundance made softness a practical necessity. Mattresses were issued because they helped soldiers recover, Clean sheets reduced infection. Pillows improved rest and morale. These two understandings of war, one shaped by scarcity and spiritual endurance, the other by industrial might and pragmatic efficiency, collided in every encounter between prisoner and guard. American soldiers, many of them farm boys or factory workers, often reacted with a mixture of curiosity and pity toward their captives. They expected fierce fighters, but not the level of malnutrition or exhaustion they found. Some guards later described the sight as humbling. Men who had fought with such intensity reduced to shadows, and for the POWs, each small kindness felt like a blow against everything they believed. A cup of soup, a bandaged foot, a guard offering water instead of violence. For the young Japanese soldier at the center of this story, the journey through this psychological conflict was just beginning. He had already endured starvation, bombardment, and the collapse of his unit. He had already stepped into captivity expecting agony. But what awaited him at the American camp would challenge the very foundation of who he thought the enemy was, and who he believed he himself was allowed to be. That confrontation between fear and reality would soon take shape in a single, quiet moment in the infirmary. A moment triggered not by gunfire or interrogation, but by the simple sight of a bed. For the Japanese POW who stood trembling before an American bed, the moment did not begin with the soft mattress or the clean blanket. It began with the unraveling of a worldview he had carried since childhood. He had been raised to believe that surrender was shameful, that the enemy was monstrous, and that captivity meant humiliation beyond imagination. These beliefs were not abstract. They shaped his identity. They informed his courage, his duty, and his fears. When he was captured, weak, dehydrated, and barely conscious, he braced himself for brutality. Every step toward the American camp tightened that tension. He expected strikes, mockery, starvation, evidence that everything he had been told was true. Yet the moment he arrived, the opposite occurred. Guards remained calm. Medics spoke gently. No one kicked him when he stumbled. When that bed finally appeared, it was not comfort he saw. It was contradiction. The neat fold of the blanket, the white linen, the care in its construction. These things struck him with a force greater than any explosion he had survived. They suggested dignity, safety, humanity. And that realization shook him more deeply than fear ever had. For the first time since his capture, he confronted a truth he had never dared imagine. The enemy was not the monster he had been taught to hate. This human collision, a lifetime of indoctrination meeting a moment of unexpected gentleness, marked the beginning of his emotional breakdown. And it set the stage for how he would understand everything that followed. To understand the power of that moment, one must understand the cultural forces pressing down on every Japanese soldier of the era. The Imperial Japanese Army did not simply encourage bravery, it demanded self-annihilation in the service of the nation. Surrender was more than defeat. It was spiritual collapse. Men were told that their families would bear their shame. They believed their ancestors watched their choices. From childhood, they learned stories of warriors who chose death rather than dishonor. Schoolbooks glorified sacrifice. Soldiers carried field manuals stating explicitly that capture was intolerable. A man who fell into enemy hands had failed Japan itself. Thus, when the young soldier surrendered, he did not feel rescued. He felt destroyed. In his mind, he had crossed a line beyond which redemption was impossible. That psychological burden shaped his entire experience as a POW. Even acts of kindness, meals, medical care, clean bedding, were filtered through a lens of shame. He questioned whether he deserved comfort. He questioned whether accepting it made him weaker. American hospitality, rooted in entirely different cultural values, only deepened this conflict. To U.S. personnel, proper bedding was standard protocol. To him, it was an unearned mercy that intensified his self-blame. This clash of values explains why a simple bed triggered not joy, but tears. It symbolized the loss of everything he had been taught to cling to: hardship, endurance, self-denial, and replaced it with a softness he had been taught to reject. In that moment, culture itself became a battlefield, and the soldier stood alone between the world he came from and the world he now faced. From the perspective of American military planners, humane treatment of Japanese POWs was not merely moral, it was strategic. The United States adhered to the Geneva Convention, but beyond legal obligations, Commanders understood that a prisoner treated with dignity could become a valuable source of intelligence. By 1944, American forces sought information on Japanese fortifications, supply shortages, troop morale, and planned defensive strategies across the Pacific. Many Japanese soldiers, once stabilized physically and psychologically, proved willing to speak, driven by exhaustion, disillusionment, or the shock of discovering that the enemy treated them more humanely than their own leadership had described. Providing POWs with medical care and proper living conditions served multiple military goals. Healthy prisoners required less supervision. They were more cooperative during questioning. They sometimes provided insight into Japanese codes of honor, command structures, and tactical expectations, knowledge that shaped American planning for future invasions. Thus, the bed offered to the young POW was not an indulgence. It was part of a systematic approach designed to stabilize captives and potentially open channels of communication. Clean sheets reduced infection. Mattresses prevented pressure sores. Comfort encouraged trust. What he experienced as an emotional breaking point, American officers saw as standard procedure, an investment in both order and intelligence. This intersection of practicality and humanity created an environment radically different from what Japanese soldiers were taught to expect, and it paved the way for the transformative moment that followed. The convergence of these human, cultural, and tactical forces brings us closer to the heart of the story, how a simple object, a bed, became a symbol powerful enough to collapse a hardened worldview. One of the most striking contrasts between the Imperial Japanese Army and the U.S. military lay not in ideology, but in logistics. By 1944-45, American supply lines operated with an efficiency that seemed almost impossible to Japanese troops. While Japanese soldiers fought on rations of rice, dried fish, or whatever they could forage, American forces received canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate bars, medical kits, and bedding by the ton. This material advantage shaped every part of the prisoner's experience. The bed he saw was not a luxury for prisoners. It was the product of a supply chain that valued sanitation, rest, and recovery. American doctrine recognized that a soldier who slept well fought well. Mattresses, blankets, and clean linens were routine, backed by factories thousands of miles away that produced them in vast quantities. For a Japanese infantryman accustomed to sleeping on bamboo mats, dirt floors, or makeshift shelters, the softness of an American bed represented something far larger. It revealed the scale of American industrial power. It demonstrated that the enemy could afford to be humane, not because they were weak, but because they were strong. This realization was disorienting. He had been taught that spiritual superiority compensated for material shortages. Yet here he saw the tangible results of a war machine that combined advanced technology, massive production, and a logistical philosophy built on abundance. The bed was more than a piece of furniture. It was a quiet statement of power, one that revealed to him why Japan was losing the war. American soldiers entered the Pacific War with their own intense emotions, anger, grief, and a desire for victory, shaped by surprise attacks and brutal fighting. Yet many guards and medics at POW camps found themselves face to face with an enemy who no longer resembled the ferocious fighters they had faced in battle. Instead, they saw starving, wounded, often terrified young men. To some guards, Japanese POWs were simply prisoners to be processed. To others, they were human beings in need of help. Accounts from the period describe American personnel surprised by the weakened condition of their captives. Some felt pity. Others felt respect for the hardships these men had endured. A few even felt conflicted, forced to reconcile the violence of combat with the vulnerability before them. This shift in perspective mattered. It influenced how prisoners were treated day to day. Many American medics followed a simple principle: a wounded man is a wounded man, regardless of the flag he fought under. Clean bandages and blankets were not moral gestures. They were medical necessities. Yet the POWs interpreted these actions through the lens of their indoctrination. What Americans saw as routine, Japanese prisoners saw as astonishing kindness. For the young soldier who would later cry at the sight of a bed, this disconnect formed the backdrop of his emotional collapse. The guards who escorted him did not think they were doing anything extraordinary, but he saw compassion where he expected cruelty, And that contrast intensified the impact of every gesture, every instruction, every moment of care that followed. War brutalizes. It reduces men to numbers, objectives, and targets. But occasionally, moments appear that defy the logic of conflict, moments in which the boundaries between enemies briefly dissolve. The American bed offered to a Japanese POW was one such moment. It was not a grand act. No speech accompanied it, no political motive drove it. It was simply a place to rest. Yet in the moral landscape of war, simplicity can be profound. The bed symbolized the idea that even in the midst of destruction, humanity can persist. It represented the refusal to strip prisoners of dignity, even when the broader conflict demanded their defeat. For the Japanese soldier, this act carried moral weight far beyond its physical comfort. He had expected suffering because suffering was all he knew. He had been told that mercy was weakness and that enemies could not be compassionate. When he learned otherwise, his emotional defenses crumbled. This moment of moral clarity did not end the war. It did not change strategy or alter the tide of battle, but it changed him. It forced him to confront the possibility that the world was larger and more complex than the narrow ideology he had inherited. In this moral collision between indoctrination and empathy, the foundations were laid for the story's turning point. A moment that would come not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of an American infirmary. These converging angles prepare us for the decisive moment, the instant when experience, culture, logistics, and humanity collided in one soldier's breaking point. By the time the young Japanese soldier was captured, he was barely recognizable as the man who had once marched confidently into battle. Weeks of starvation had carved deep shadows beneath his eyes. His uniform hung loosely over a frame, reduced to bone and sinew. His feet were blistered, his skin bruised, and his thoughts clouded by fever. When American troops found him, half-conscious in a thicket of kunai grass, he did not resist. He simply stared, waiting for the blow that would end his fear. It never came. Instead, he was lifted onto a stretcher and carried toward a staging area under the watch of armed guards. Every movement around him felt unreal. American soldiers spoke quickly, their voices firm, but not cruel. One handed him water, another checked his pulse. He flinched at the touch, but no pain followed. The expectation of brutality clung to him like a second skin. Yet each moment without violence only deepened the confusion inside him. When the jeep transporting him to the POW camp rolled forward, he felt the rumble of the engine beneath him, steady, mechanical, powerful. American vehicles were plentiful, unlike the scarce equipment that had dominated his own experience. Even this difference felt overwhelming. It was as if he were being transported not to another camp, but to another world. Upon arrival, he was escorted past the gates. The barbed wire gleamed in the sunlight, but the guards did not shout or strike him. They directed him toward the camp infirmary, where wounded prisoners, Japanese and Okinawan alike, waited for treatment. A medic approached with a clipboard, his tone calm, his posture professional. The soldier tensed again, expecting the interrogation to begin. Yet the medic only gestured for him to sit while his temperature was taken. Inside the infirmary tent, the air smelled of antiseptic and canvas. Wooden cots lined the walls, each draped in white sheets that seemed impossibly bright compared to the grime of the battlefield. Lamps hung from the support beams, casting a soft glow over the wounded. Nurses moved between the beds, checking bandages and distributing medicine with practiced efficiency. For the soldier, each detail felt like a contradiction. He had been told Americans mistreated prisoners. He had been told the enemy lacked honor. He had been told mercy did not exist outside Japan. Yet here, in this quiet space, mercy seemed to flow without effort. The medic assigned to him examined his wounds, cleaned the cuts on his legs, and applied fresh bandages. When he winced, the medic slowed, offering reassurance in a language he barely understood. The soldier lowered his gaze, unable to meet the man's eyes. He did not know how to respond to kindness. Then came the moment that would break him. A guard guided him to a corner of the infirmary where an unused cot stood. It was neatly made, with a mattress that rose slightly above the wooden frame, a wool blanket folded with geometric precision, and a pillow that looked impossibly soft. The soldier stopped walking. He could not take another step. His mind raced. Was this a test? A deception? A trick to expose weakness? For months he had slept on soil, stone, or rotting bedding in dark caves filled with insects. Comfort had become a memory so distant it felt unreal. Now, faced with a clean bed prepared for him, an enemy soldier, a captive, a supposed disgrace, his senses faltered. The guard gestured again. "Lie down," he said slowly, clearly. The soldier's stomach tightened. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He felt the weight of his shame, the weight of his indoctrination, the weight of every story he had believed. His breath grew shallow. His knees trembled. And then, without warning, his vision blurred. A single tear slid down his cheek. It was not the softness of the mattress that broke him. It was the collapse of fear, the collapse of lies, the collapse of an identity built on the belief that the enemy would never show mercy. He lowered himself onto the bed, the mattress yielding beneath him. The wool blanket brushed lightly against his skin. For the first time in months, he felt warmth that was not from fever or the oppressive sun, but from care. His hands shook as he pulled the blanket over his chest. Another tear followed, then another, until the fabric beneath him darkened. No one spoke, no one mocked him. The camp moved quietly around him, respecting the space that had opened inside him. For the young soldier, this was the turning point, not of the war, but of his inner world. Everything he had believed about the Americans was wrong. Everything he had feared was untrue, and everything he had resisted feeling, relief, safety, vulnerability, flooded through him at once. This moment of emotional collapse set in motion a transformation that would continue in the days ahead, shaping his cooperation, his recovery, and his understanding of the war itself. In the hours following his emotional collapse, the young Japanese soldier lay silent on the American cot, eyes open but unfocused. His body rested, but his mind churned. Waves of confusion washed over him, relief tangled with shame, gratitude tangled with guilt. Every breath felt like a betrayal of the ideals he had grown up with. Yet, he could not deny the undeniable. The enemy he feared had treated him better in minutes than his own army had treated him in months. As his fever eased and strength began to return, American medics continued their routine care. They checked his pulse, cleaned his wounds, and ensured he drank enough water to stabilize his condition. The simple consistency of their efforts was unsettling. He kept waiting for the moment when the kindness would vanish and the cruelty of propaganda would reveal itself. But that moment never came. Instead, something unexpected began to happen. He started observing the other POWs. Some were wounded like he was. Others were malnourished, recovering from months of isolation on islands where resistance had collapsed. A few, those who had been in the camp longer, spoke quietly with guards or medics, exchanging simple English phrases or nodding with familiarity. They accepted meals without hesitation. They walked the yard. They slept. To the soldier, this normalcy was incomprehensible. How could men who had surrendered, men who had broken the vow of no retreat, no surrender, carry themselves with calm acceptance? How could they sleep peacefully in enemy beds? How could they live without the crushing weight of shame? For days he wrestled with these questions. But as the fear receded, something else began to emerge. Trust. Not complete trust, not yet, but the subtle recognition that the people caring for him meant no harm. It showed in small moments. A guard adjusted the angle of a lamp so its brightness wouldn't disturb him. A medic left an extra blanket at the foot of his bed without comment. A nurse placed a bowl of broth beside him and waited patiently until he was strong enough to lift the spoon. None of these gestures were dramatic. They were not acts of generosity meant to win hearts. They were simply the routines of a system designed to keep men, enemy or not, alive. Yet for a soldier taught that Americans were monsters, these routines became revelations. In the afternoons, when he had regained enough strength to sit up, an intelligence officer visited the infirmary to speak with prisoners. The officer did not shout. He did not threaten. Instead, he asked calm, measured questions about the soldier's unit, his commanding officers, his situation when he was captured. At first, the young POW said nothing. He kept his gaze low, speaking only when required. But over time, he found himself responding, not out of loyalty to the Americans, but out of exhaustion. His war was over. The collapse in front of the bed had marked its end. The information he provided was minimal at first. Details about terrain, supply shortages, troop morale, hardly secrets. But even these fragments were valuable to American planners preparing for future operations across the Pacific. Each insight helped build a clearer picture of an enemy struggling under the weight of dwindling resources and morale. For the soldier, however, the more significant transformation lay not in what he said, but in what he understood. He began to see the Americans not as devils, but as men. Men who laughed, ate, joked, and argued. Men who carried photographs of families, just as Japanese soldiers did. Men who, despite the brutality of the war, could still choose compassion when given the chance. This realization did not erase his shame. In Japanese cultural memory, surrender carried a shadow that lasted a lifetime. He knew he could never truly escape that weight. But the bed he had collapsed into, its softness, its warmth, its unexpected kindness, remained a reminder that the enemy he had feared was not the enemy he had met. In the weeks that followed, he regained strength. He walked without assistance. He ate full meals for the first time in months. And although he rarely spoke, he listened. He watched. He learned. Stories began circulating among the POWs, tales of men who had been treated with similar care, of guards who shared cigarettes or jokes, of medics who spent sleepless nights tending to fevers. The soldier absorbed these accounts quietly. They confirmed what he now understood from experience. His moment in front of the bed was not unique. It was part of a pattern, repeated across the Pacific as thousands of Japanese POWs confronted the humanity of an enemy they had been taught to despise. This collective experience, shared in whispers and nods between beds, would shape their sense of the war long after they returned home. But for now, the soldier's transformation centered on that single moment, the moment when he stepped toward the American bed and everything he believed gave way. He still did not know what the future held. He did not know whether he would survive the war or where he would be sent next. But he knew one thing with clarity. The world was different from what he had been taught, and that realization would shape the consequences that followed, both for him and for thousands of POWs like him. In the days that followed his recovery, the Japanese soldier settled into the quiet rhythm of camp life. Each morning began with roll call, followed by a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal or bread, sometimes accompanied by fruit or canned meat. To him, these meals felt almost extravagant. He had grown accustomed to half rations, or to surviving on whatever plants or insects he could find in the jungle. Now, food arrived predictably, without struggle, and in quantities that felt almost unsettling. His body responded slowly, muscles regained strength. His face, once gaunt and hollow, began to soften. A medic remarked that he looked years younger than when he arrived. The soldier did not smile, but he acknowledged the comment with a small bow. Even that small gesture represented a shift. Weeks earlier, he would not have made eye contact with an American. Across the camp, similar transformations were unfolding. Japanese POWs, many captured after devastating battles on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, slowly returned to health. Some were young conscripts who had never seen combat before their surrender. Others were veterans of campaigns stretching back to China, yet nearly all shared the same reaction: confusion at the unexpected humanity shown to them. American reports from the period noted this repeatedly. Medics and officers wrote of prisoners who wept when given clean clothing, who hesitated before eating because they feared it might be a trick, who apologized repeatedly for accepting medical care. The depth of their indoctrination made even basic kindness feel foreign. The young soldier experienced this emotional tension every day. When handed a blanket, he hesitated. When invited to take a second serving of rice, he declined, unsure if it was permitted. When guards treated him with respect, he felt a pang of shame rather than relief. Every act of humanity forced him to confront the collapse of the ideology that had shaped him since childhood. Yet, the routine continued. Gradually, the resistance faded. In the infirmary, he helped distribute water to other prisoners. Once he regained his strength, he swept the floors, folded linens, and assisted in minor tasks, a quiet way of repaying what he felt he owed. American personnel did not ask for this help. They accepted it with quiet nods, understanding that such gestures carried immense emotional weight for men recovering not only from battle, but from indoctrination. Outside the medical ward, the camp environment remained orderly. Prisoners worked in gardens, repaired equipment, or assisted in maintaining the camp's infrastructure. These tasks offered structure and purpose, grounding men who had previously known only the rigid hierarchy of military life. The young soldier observed that not all captives reacted the same way. Some remained distant, refusing to speak with Americans or even with fellow POWs. Others withdrew into themselves, avoiding eye contact and conversation. The shame of surrender seemed to consume them, but many others slowly adapted, forming quiet friendships within the camp and learning enough English to communicate simple requests. American supervisors noted that Japanese prisoners tended to maintain discipline and order more strictly than POWs from other nations. They lined up neatly, they cleaned their living quarters without being asked. They showed respect to authority figures, even those from the enemy military. This behavior reflected both cultural norms and the deep-seated desire to regain a sense of purpose. For the young soldier, each day of camp life widened the distance between the world he had known and the world he now inhabited. He still carried shame, but it no longer defined his every moment. The memory of collapsing before the American bed remained vivid, yet it had transformed from a source of humiliation into a symbol of awakening, a moment that revealed the humanity present even in the midst of war. And as the weeks turned into months, the consequences of that moment began to ripple outward, shaping not only his recovery, but his worldview. As 1945 progressed and the Pacific War neared its end, the experiences of Japanese POWs began to diverge sharply from the expectations they had carried into captivity. Many, including the young soldier who had broken down at the sight of the American bed, found themselves confronting a startling reality. They were being treated with more dignity in enemy hands than they had ever imagined possible. Yet this realization created a complex emotional landscape. Relief came first, relief that they were alive, fed, and cared for. But relief soon gave way to another feeling that was harder to navigate, the dread of returning home. Japan still regarded surrender as a profound disgrace. News of captivity often brought shame to families. Soldiers who survived as POWs knew they might be viewed not as survivors, but as failures. Some even believed they might face hostility or ostracism once repatriated. The young soldier understood this with painful clarity. He carried the burden silently as the weeks passed, unsure whether the kindness he received in the camp could ever outweigh the condemnation he feared at home. Yet the experience had changed him. The moment before the bed, his collapse, his tears, remained etched in his memory. It had altered something fundamental inside him, and that change continued to unfold as the war's end approached. By late summer, news of the atomic bombings filtered into the camp in fragments. Rumors of devastation spread among prisoners. Then, in mid-August, the announcement came. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For many POWs, the moment sparked a mixture of emotions, shock, sorrow, and a quiet sense of relief. There would be no final battle, no call to die honorably. But with relief came fear of the unknown. What awaited them when they returned to Japan? How would their families react? Would society accept them, or would their captivity follow them for the rest of their lives? American personnel, aware of these anxieties, made efforts to prepare the prisoners for repatriation. They conducted interviews, provided basic education programs, and sometimes shared magazines or translated news articles to help prisoners understand the world beyond the battlefield. The young soldier absorbed these materials quietly, searching for clues about the life he would soon return to. As repatriation ships began transporting POWs back to Japan, American officers documented their experiences. Many wrote that Japanese prisoners expressed deep gratitude for their treatment. Others described men who were conflicted, unsure how to reconcile the compassion they had received from the enemy with the beliefs they had carried into the war. When the young soldier finally boarded a transport ship, he carried with him only a small bundle of clothing and a few handwritten notes from American medics thanking him for his help in the infirmary. The gesture meant more to him than he could express. It was a reminder that, despite the war's brutality, he had encountered humanity in an unexpected place. Upon returning to Japan, he stepped onto a homeland scarred by fire and loss. Cities lay in ruins. Families grieved sons, brothers, and husbands who had never returned. The country he had left was not the country he found. For many former POWs, silence became a shield. They rarely spoke of their experiences, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. The young soldier followed the same path, keeping the memory of the American bed to himself. It became a private symbol of mercy, of contradiction, of the unexpected ways war reshapes human identity. In the years that followed, Japan underwent profound transformation. Public understanding of the war shifted. Stories of POWs who had survived due to humane treatment slowly began to emerge. Scholars, veterans, and families shared accounts that challenged older assumptions. They revealed that acts of kindness had occurred even in the darkest chapters of history. For the soldier, now older and living in a peaceful nation, the memory of that moment in the infirmary never faded. He did not recount it often, but when he did, he spoke softly, almost reverently. He said that the war had taken everything from him, his strength, his certainty, his sense of who he was. But the sight of that bed and the humanity behind it had given something back. And as the years passed, he came to understand that this quiet moment of mercy had been more than an act of care. It had been a bridge between two worlds, a reminder that even in war, humanity can reveal itself in the simplest of gestures. War is often remembered through its battles, through the thunder of artillery, the clash of armies, and the sweeping movements of nations. But its deepest impressions are sometimes made in silence, in quiet rooms. In moments so small they pass unnoticed by history books, yet linger for a lifetime in the men who live them. The Japanese soldier who cried when he saw an American bed did not weep because of softness or luxury. He wept because the moment revealed a truth buried beneath years of fear and indoctrination. The enemy was human. The world was larger than the narrow frame he had been taught to accept. And even in the midst of the most devastating conflict humanity had ever endured, compassion could still find its way through the cracks. His tears were not a sign of weakness. They were an acknowledgement, an unspoken admission that the beliefs he had carried into war were collapsing before a simple act of mercy. Recovery for him began not with medicine or rest, but with the realization that dignity could survive even in captivity. In the decades that followed, the story of men like him quietly shaped the way Japan remembered the war. Their testimonies, often low, hesitant, and colored by shame, revealed that the lines between enemy and ally were not as absolute as they once appeared. Humanity had persisted behind barbed wire, across language barriers, and beneath the weight of unimaginable suffering. The bed that broke him was not just a physical object. It was a symbol, a reminder that war's brutality cannot fully extinguish empathy. A testament to the unexpected ways compassion reshapes those who encounter it. And in the end, his single tear, shed in a quiet American infirmary in 1945, became a reflection of a universal truth, that even in humanity's darkest hours, small acts of decency can change a life, alter a worldview, and echo long after the guns have fallen silent.